Great. Thank you, Allie. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Eikenberry. I'm the wetland specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I'll be getting us started. And then Ryan Crehan with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will be taking it from there. So thanks again for being here as we talk about wetlands restoration with the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, wetland reserve easements in Vermont. So next slide, please. Great. So I want to talk a little bit about why we have this program through the Farm Bill in the first place that is focused on restoring agriculturally altered wetlands. And it really gets at historic wetlands loss in the United States. As you can see from this slide, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has estimates from 1780 to 1980 regarding wetlands loss throughout the United States. Noted right here are some of the states that have some remarkably high levels of wetlands loss. On our next slide, we'll see what wetlands loss was in Vermont, but it's a nationwide program. As you can see, there are millions of acres lost nationwide. Next slide, please. So in Vermont, in that same time period, the majority of wetland loss that happened was related to agricultural clearing. And that was about 121,000 acres. 100,000 acres. And so the percentage lost is about 35% of the wetlands that were estimated to be in Vermont at that time. So that's a lot of land. A great deal of that land is still being actively farmed now. And so there are a lot of farms that are, have ditch drained, otherwise, hydrologically altered wetlands that they're doing their best to farm. And a lot of that was cleared back during that time frame. So there's been a lot of historic wetlands loss in Vermont. Next slide, please. And this is just another example of from some archived photos about some of the equipment that they'd use. And they really weren't afraid to get into some really challenging places and to really, with the equipment that was at hand, do some pretty amazing alterations. There are parts of Vermont, especially in Rutland, Addison, and parts of Franklin counties where some pretty amazing changes in hydrology occurred with the equipment at the time. This is an example of a drag line that was commonly used to get in there and to create some pretty big ditches and really just transform these wetlands. Next slide, please. Another example, this one, that truck that shows up on the left with the little backhoe on the back showed up in tons of old photos. I think it belonged to one of the conservation districts. And they were able to get that little truck into all sorts of places and put all sorts of diversion ditches in and other ways where they were just moving water around. And so our landscape, especially in areas where they were, heavier clay or silt loam wetland soils in the first place, has been very transformed in Vermont. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a little bit of background from a programmatic standpoint about our Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, Wetland Reserve Easements, ASAP-WRE. And then Ryan's going to give some good examples of recent projects and, exciting restorations that have been happening. So the current version of ASAP-WRE that is in the Farm Bill really focuses a lot on land that was wetland was then manipulated and altered from its wetland state to have a lot of hydrologic manipulation. So think of ditches, tile drainage, land smoothing, all sorts of also interception ditches if they're catching water and keeping it from ever getting to the wetland or the field. Lots of different ways that they altered these sites and took it from how it was receiving water or what the overall topography was and made it more able to be farmed. That December 23rd, 1985 date is in there because of our Food Security Act wetlands conservation compliance requirements. So it's really looking at a more of a historic manipulation, and it could be something that somebody's maintaining, but it's not somebody who, a few years ago decided to drain a wetland and then all of a sudden they want to get a wetlands easement. That they wouldn't really be eligible. But folks who have these historically altered, sort of that 121, 100,000 acres we were looking at there, they're the folks that we're looking to see if they're interested in working with us in this program. the bulk of the ranking points and the focus of the program is on wetlands hydrology restoration for ASAP WRE as it currently exists. There'll be a new type of RCPP that will be basically WRE-like starting October 1st, 2021. That's not going to be in the scope of what we're talking about today. That'll have some different rules that apply to it. But for what we're talking about today, a real focus is on hydrologically restoring wetlands and then connecting with those hydrologically restored wetlands existing habitat that makes sense to put into an easement. So that oftentimes includes riparian areas along rivers and streams, other intact wetlands that maybe were never drained but are functionally connected to the drained wetlands that it would make sense to include from a habitat standpoint, and then uplands as well that can make sense to buffer the wetland and also help for a lot of species that are dependent on the uplands for a certain percentage of their life cycle. And there's a lot of amphibians in particular where that's the case. And it wouldn't be very good for them to only have breeding habitat and then have nowhere else to be for 6 to 8 months of the year. They couldn't survive. So it's important to have uplands as well when possible as permanently protected parts of a wetland easement. The ASAP WRE program itself is first a wildlife habitat program. So when you look at all the goals and the purposes that Congress put forth for the program, the #1 goal is wildlife habitat with a particular emphasis on waterfowl and migratory birds. So that's a main push. So we there have lots of other benefits, water quality benefits, sediment retention, phosphorus retention, lots of other co-benefits to the program, but first and foremost, it's a wildlife habitat program. And so that's something to bear in mind as you're thinking about it. The easements itself acquire development rights, which are oftentimes limited on some of these sites. The main right that's acquired and they get compensation for are agricultural use rights. Other ancillary rights that are inherently scooped up in the easement are channel management rights and things of that nature. And so it's basically somebody who's willing to take land that they're farming or has been farmed and was, manipulated wetlands, even if they're not farming it, but it still could be hydrologically restored. And they're willing to sell those rights and allow it to go back into wildlife habitat. The remaining rights are quiet enjoyment, their ability to use the land. But NRCS has an in perpetuity commitment and obligation to manage that land for wildlife habitat purposes and to have the legal right to go in there and to plug ditches, put in wetland depressions, do easement monitoring, manage vegetation. Those rights are purchased and owned by the federal government. So I won't belabor that too much. It's something we can get into more details on in the questions section. And Ryan's going to give some really good slides that will give you a better idea of how do we find these areas and then what does it look like when we restore them. And then from there, we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about, program eligibility and wetland restoration. So I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, Crehan with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thanks, Jim. So I guess I want to first start and just mention that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a private lands program called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, where we work with willing landowners to restore or enhance wildlife habitat. So in Vermont, we've had a great partnership for over a decade now on doing just that. So first thing I want to think about is in Vermont, when we're thinking about what sites we're focused on, we're typically looking at floodplain wetlands. These were the site where there was extensive draining, as shown in Jim's earlier slides. And these are the sites that we can restore them and really get a lot of the functions and values back with our restoration practices. These sites also have high value for wildlife, also for fish habitat, flood flow attenuation, nutrient removal, sediment deposition, and often just from a wildlife corridor standpoint. So these are sites that have a lot of value. They're typically, you can see on the aerial photo, we've got like a main ditch on this site. We have several other ditches on the perimeter of the property. And you can still see on the aerial photo some of those old meander scars that show where that kind of hydrology is still persisting, even though this was a cornfield at the time, but still had, you could still see the potential there. If we kind of get a little closer, those are the sites, like I said, marginal farmland. So the photo on the right is a cornfield where that was all planted, but obviously due to wetness, most of that corn crop failed, and you have a mix of wetland plants there instead. So looking at different kind of natural communities on these sites, we're trying to think about how do we get these sites back to in the direction, the trajectory that the site was going before it was altered. So oftentimes we'll have these floodplain forests, which have a mix of, sensitive firm, and you can see on a picture like this where you have that micro topography that really drives the hydrology as well as the vegetation, which of course is important for the wildlife that depends on it. So we're going to be looking at what kind of sites there might be remnants of to get a sense of what was there. We also look at some of these old aerial photos, and you can see on the 1942 aerial, this is a site along Otter Creek. Kind of up through the middle, there's a stream with kind of a scrub shrub wetland along it. When we jump ahead to 1994, you can still see a little remnant of that stream in the lower end of the photo, but the site is now, the stream has been kind of railroaded along a fence line straight to Otter Creek. And you have these other ditches that are actually draining the floodplain back into that and then off site. So we have impacted stream. We also have lost a lot of that floodplain function and value on a site like that. If we kind of dig into more of the historical records, this is a site in Colchester that, if we look at kind of the old, the USDA's Soil Conservation Service had some good records of when they were working with landowners, as Jim mentioned, to drain some of these sites. And you can see from the photo, we get a better sense of what they were using the land for, whether it was cropland or pasture or even wildlife areas. And more importantly, we can see where there's open drains, open ditching, quite extensive on this site. Places where right down the middle, they've straightened a stream coming in there to basically remove that water from the site. And then also land smoothing. You can see multiple places on this where they note land smoothing, which is hugely important for kind of how the soil is going to form out there, what vegetation is going to thrive there, and then what kind of wildlife value, everything from amphibians up to mammals and all in between as far as how that site is going to be utilized. So we do try to look at, so this gives us a good kind of indication of what we need to do to try to undo some of this and get that site functioning as it was. So from a lot of elevation surveying on the ground, as well as just extensive assessment, I'll work with NRCS and create a design that kind of gives a sense of what we're looking for on this site. In this site, that green is kind of the area where we want to reestablish that floodplain forest, the drier area on the higher natural levee along the river. This site had a berm, over a mile-long berm, that actually prevented it from flooding. It wasn't until Irene did it actually get flooded. Ever since the 70s, it had been removed from the floodplain. And then it has extensive ditching. So we're going to look at how we can remove that material to get that hydrology back. And then also look at where that's going to hold water, where we might add some depressional work to increase, kind of mimic some of that lost topography from the . kind of base that design off of.
We lost you for a minute there, Ryan. So glad that you're back.
Oh, yeah. Feel free to wave your hand, Jim, if I lose you again. But essentially, so this site, as a lot of these sites go, the corn was grown along that higher natural levee along the river, and then it was hayed in the lower areas. So we're looking kind of down a ditch on that hayfield that was hayed before restoration, and the restoration for this site was done in 2014. And then that's kind of the following season. We have a really great explosion of native wetland vegetation. We get some really good zonation based on the water depth there. So we're getting more of the woody plants on the higher areas, and then more of the emergent and really great wildlife habitat, as well as important, just because now the river is actually flooding this site. It's about 120 acres. And when you think about how this site was removed from the floodplain, this has been very beneficial for a variety of values. So in general, we think of restoration as trying to put something back. And with restoration, it's always a moving target. But with all these kind of designs and considerations, it's important to note that we are generally how our climate has been changing. And basically in this photo here, this graph, you can see that trend line in yellow is showing that Vermont over the last 50 years has been getting wetter, roughly an inch of precipitation every 10 years in addition to what it was back in the 50s. So when you're thinking about it from kind of agricultural land, some of these sites, and we hear this a lot, where the site is getting wetter and or it's getting harder to farm. And this year obviously was a very dry year, but in most years they're having more trouble. And it's not, and you hear that on the ground, and it matches what we're seeing from the recorded data, is that these sites are becoming more marginal for farming. So I think that's another reason why the floodplain wetland sites are kind of high value for restoration potential. It also means that we have to consider what our restoration design is and how we're measuring success, because potentially we might not be shifting it back to a historical condition when the whole site is changing so much. In addition to increased rainfall on an annual basis, those big storms, kind of the high precipitation of events are becoming much bigger as well, particularly in the Northeast. So, we're just over a year. If we just think back to just over a year, the Halloween storm, that's the kind of storm where, that was 3 to 5 inches of rainfall in less than 10 hours for a sizable percentage of the state. And so those floodplains were receiving a lot of inputs from there. We had record flows on the Missisquoi and high flows on a number of rivers. So it kind of reinforces the value of those floodplain restoration projects so that we can kind of take some of those high flows. It also can make some of these floodplain wetlands or floodplain sites harder to farm because they are getting flooded at additional times than perhaps in addition to spring flooding, you might have mid-season flooding, which is obviously creates a challenge for getting a crop off a site. All right, sorry for those who have small screens on this. Just want to give you, this is just trying to give you a general framework on this picture. This is a map. The blue line is Otter Creek. It's in the south, is on the bottom of the map is Pittsford, just north of Rutland. And on the top of the map is Middlebury, which obviously Otter Creek flowing north to Lake Champlain. And on this, it's just to kind of give a sense, the red are NRCS wetland reserve easement projects that we've collaborated on. And what I just wanted to point out is that what starts out with just a single landowner or a small project has really grown into kind of a landscape level projects. And in addition to the work that NRCS and the Fish and Wildlife Service have done, is the purple is state land, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department wildlife management areas, and the yellow is Nature Conservancy land. And so if we kind of combine those all together, we have a really, we're building on a really nice corridor along there that really enhances the value of any of these projects through this collaborative effort. So right now, Otter Creek has several thousand acres of land in the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. So just taking a moment to look at what's happened this year. In terms of, for the restoration work, there's typically a fair, we do earthwork that in order to restore the hydrology and the topography of these sites. So in 2020, we had several sites in the Otter Creek drainage, including a project in Salisbury, which we'll look at a little closer, Sudbury, and in Leicester. So those are all along Otter Creek. Also had a project in Newport along a tributary of the Missisquoi, in Orange along the jail branch of the Winooski. And then in addition, though these last two aren't NRCS involved projects, those were projects where I partnered with Vermont Land Trust on a project along the Connecticut River in Springfield and along Lake Champlain Direct in St. Albans. So we had a busy season that actually went really well, particularly because it was so dry out on these sites. So just wanted to show you a little bit about this site. This is a site in Salisbury. It's a 180-acre site with over a mile of river frontage on this. You can kind of see in that map, there's all those black lines are all a whole network of ditches. You can, if you look really close, you can kind of see the spoil piles next to them from when they did the ditching next to those ditches. So for this site, we also have the railroad on the east side of the site. And so the goal with this was to restore the hydrology as effectively as possible without impacting the railroad or neighboring land use, because it's on an active farm and the neighboring fields are still farmed. So for this site, we did 12 ditch plugs out there, as well as depressional wetlands, pit and mound features, as well as woody debris. And so like I mentioned, we use heavy equipment to do this. It was a great season for this work on sites that basically have wetland soils. So in this, we're trying to restore some of that lost topography through depressional wetland features. We're going to basically be trying to get the bones of the system back by getting that topography, working that soil, or also add in woody debris, both for wildlife habitat, but then also just for nutrient cycling as well, to kind of propel that site along. These sites also will get planted with trees and shrubs next year. And we did also work on areas that are currently in reed canary grass that are difficult for trees to get established. So this area in this photo was reed canary grass. It was plowed mid-season to basically alter the topography of that, create some micro topography in the process, and encourage the establishment of other plants out there other than reed canary grass. We also were looking to make it so seed from like natural regeneration from that existing floodplain forest would have a better chance of success. This area was also direct seeded with silver maples. And so far it responded really well to that work. Other areas were herbicided with the similar goal of trying to knock back the grass to give a little window for areas that will be planted, as well as natural regeneration. In West Rutland, it was similar work in that there was a berm, extensive ditching, berms, spoil piles that were removed from the wetland. The ditches were plugged, and then that topography was restored with some features to mimic what would have been on the landscape in terms of kind of depressional wetlands, woody debris, and added as well as pit and mound features. This site will also be planted next year as well. Like I mentioned, that site in Leicester, that was done in 2014. We removed about 1,000 feet of that berm in 2014. And then in 2020, another 500 feet of that berm was removed. This berm was about 3 to 4 feet tall, 25 feet wide. Essentially, it was, we had created holes in it in areas that were most conducive for flood flows, but just removing that, just dealing with that much material takes a little time. So this material was excavated.
We'll give Ryan just a minute to see if it kicks in again. Well, sorry about this, folks. Jim, do you?
Yeah, I can. If we can undo his sharing, I can get to the slide deck.
Yeah. Okay. It looks like the sharing has stopped.
Okay, give me just a second.
We can also see you again, Ryan.
Oh, he's back. Maybe he can get the sharing back. Is he?
Ryan, can you hear us? Oh, there we go. Can other people see Ryan's screen?
No, unfortunately.
No. Okay. Just a black screen. Okay, well,
We were
Ryan,
actually
go ahead, Jim.
we were pretty much done with the slide deck. There was, other than that, there was like a slide about tree planting. And so I think that we did accomplish the slide deck. Unfortunately, it looks like Ryan is still frozen. Oh, I see him moving now. Are you back, Ryan?
Yeah. I think so.
Yes, perfect. All right, Ryan's back.
All right. Sorry. I even moved so I was closer to the router. All right, so just to finish up, this site was from a few years ago. It starts out, these sites are really neat in that they look a little stark to begin with, but then pretty quickly they respond quite well. So, just 35 days later, we're looking at a pretty transformed site. So with that, we can take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jim and Ryan. We do have a question from, let me just navigate to this here, from Rick Hopkins. He asks, is there a hit list of priority wetland sites that state or federal agencies believe would be good or very good candidate sites for ACEP or a P4W program? If so, can a list or lists be shared with conservation districts?
Yeah, I'll take that. And so the answer is that there has been a layer out there for years. It was recently updated through a Department of Environmental Conservation grant process. And that data is now available. And you can go to the ANR Natural Resources Atlas and then work through to where the wetlands data is at. And then there is a wetlands restoration potential layer. So it is already out there and available from a public standpoint for you to look at and utilize. There is some specific data related to that that is more specific about certain project packets, and it has some information that is a bit more protected. But if somebody is a partner working with NRCS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, typically that's data that we're able to share with them. Other ways that are out there to think about potential wetlands restoration, the Nature Conservancy has done some analyses, and they've got some interesting data as well available, both in their former water quality blueprint and now in some new ecological economics analyses, looking at the most efficient way from an economic standpoint and from a nutrient retention standpoint to look at things. So you could be in touch with the Nature Conservancy as well if you're interested in those data.
Great, thank you.
Allie, can I make a comment?
Yes.
Ryan and Jim, thanks so much. Two comments here. If it did not come through in Ryan and Jim's talk, wetland restoration is probably the single most practice that accomplishes the most co-benefits of anything that we do in Vermont. So all of the things that they talked about from a habitat standpoint, from a water quality standpoint, from a flood resilience, there isn't any one single thing we do, or I would challenge someone to show it to me, that gets the benefit that we get out of wetland restoration. Second comment, I hope everybody understands that we are, as I talk to my counterparts all along the East Coast, that we are extremely fortunate to have the expertise that we do in Jim and Ryan to deliver this program, in combination with our state partners in DEC and Fish and Wildlife. Vermont really is doing a cutting edge front end wetland restoration stuff. And I hear that from a lot of my counterparts throughout the mid-Atlantic states, as well as into the Northeast. So we're really, really appreciative of all the work that you guys do.
Thanks, Chris. That was Chris Smith from Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, it looks like we've got more questions coming in. So we have a question from John Thurgood with NRCS. He asks, have you estimated the amount of carbon that is sequestered by restoring wetlands?
Yeah, I'll take that one too. Thanks for the question, John. We don't presently have a mechanism for doing that. We are working through our wetland restoration criteria guidelines, which was a new Farm Bill requirement, to get at some of that. And I've been in touch with our soil scientists who've been in touch with other soil scientists about ways of quantifying that. So it is something that we do want to better understand, and it's in process to see if we can get some data on that. But some of the ways that you would get into that could be remarkably detailed and expensive. So we're trying to see if there's a field measure that we can use to then approximate, based a lot on organic matter content.
Thank you. We have another question from Vicki Drew with NRCS. What strategy do you use to motivate producers to consider this program?
Sure, good question. That's a nice leading question. Thank you, Vicki. We partner with the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts and also local conservation districts from an outreach standpoint. And one of the main motivators for a lot of folks in this program is an economic incentive. So the USDA NRCS does pay either based on an appraisal or another methodology for assessing value of land, a one-time payment for the values that are acquired in the easement. NRCS also handles 100% of the acquisition costs of the wetland easement, including a boundary survey for the easement itself, lawyer fees, that kind of thing. We pay 100% of the wetland restoration costs, and incur 100% of the easement monitoring and management costs as well. So a lot of that is a major benefit to somebody who wants to see this land restored. We additionally partner with the Department of Environmental Conservation Program through the Wetlands Program, and they have an incentive payment that, especially if one is in a highly targeted part of the state for water quality improvements, that the landowner could potentially be eligible for, that in many ways I look at as sort of an ecological benefits payment that is sort of separate from the real estate side of things, where it's another way to incentivize the landowner to participate and to further make it of economically advantageous for them.
If I could just add to that, I think for all of these projects, we're really fortunate to have on the ground folks, and sometimes it's NRCS field staff, sometimes it's conservation district folks, or Vermont DEC folks, or Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and it's kind of like who's the person who has the rapport, and then that the landowner is gonna have a relationship with, that can kind of ease them in, because it is all voluntary. So we do need them to want to do it, and having that relationship makes a huge difference.
We have another question, one from Julie Fallonsby with DEC. She asks, are you finding that tree planting is worth the money versus prepping sites and allowing for natural regeneration? There's multiple questions, so I'll just read it and we can take them one at a time if that's helpful. Is there a size density that is more effective than others? And are there places on the landscape where there is more or less value to planting, excuse me?
Yeah, I'll start with that, then hand it over to Ryan. So, it depends. How close is the nearby regeneration, source? So if you're really, really far away from a nice stand of silver maples, it could take a very long time for seeds to get to your site. So there could be sites where that tree planting, artificial regeneration is the way to go. We have a lot of success on the areas that are around wetland depressions and the mounds, because they're fairly free of weed competition. I think we don't know yet on the answer as far as the economic viability of it, but I think in a couple years we will know, because Ryan's been really successful in getting multiple areas plowed and then also herbicide work done. And we've been pleasantly surprised by the quality of native wetlands vegetation that is coming up in areas that have been plowed or have herbicide work and plowing. So I'll hand it off to Ryan from there.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that's a great topic for another talk, because I know there's folks in my office and at the state that have done a lot of work on that. But I would say I definitely haven't given up on tree planting. I think areas that have dense reed canary grass, and I think after being on sites, there's definitely there are sites where it's just really there's reed canary grass and then there's reed canary grass, and I don't think it's very valuable to plant those without doing site prep. I think other areas we can. Essentially, we're trying to get as much benefit for the least amount of cost or work. So I think that requires using multiple techniques. So the site I mentioned, I mean, we will be planning that, but we're herbiciding part of it. We're plowing another part. We're direct seeding. We're just trying to be as comprehensive, and we have other sites that really are doing great coming in on their own. It really depends on the site. You just I think you need to spend a lot of time kind of mapping out what's coming in and what how you're measuring the success of a project.
We have a question from John Thurgood with NRCS. Will you please discuss successes with the reestablishment of wildlife species as a result of your restoration efforts?
Yeah, and again, I'll start and then hand it off to Ryan after I give my little bit. So we do a lot of presence absence monitoring of sites to see what is out there from a species standpoint. We've also recently retained the services of Jim Andrews to do herpetological studies on our sites, and there's a lot of sort of anecdotal data that we have, and then we're building on that. So I couldn't specifically say that species X has totally been saved in that local population because of our easements, but we know because of the work we're doing that, you know, the areas that are dense reed canary grass and drained wetlands that don't have much activity from a nesting bird standpoint and from waterfowl. And then when we come back and have done all the hydrology work, there can be some pretty amazing transformations. And the site that Ryan talked about where we did the berm removal is probably one of the best examples of a site that went from, you know, a hayfield and a cornfield that was providing pretty minimal amounts of wildlife habitat for a suite of species to then the whole range of species that have been seen out there, from fish, where we've done fish studies out there, to astonishing amounts of leopard frogs that are using that whole wetland complex and connecting to the Otter Creek. And then I'll let Ryan speak to the whole vast array of waterfowl and other birds he's seen out there as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that speaks to a lot of these projects, is how much we can do monitoring, which we always want to do more. I think, you know, we do have some sites where we have, you know, birds like pied-billed grebes that are nesting there that were really uncommon in the area. You know, we have sites where ospreys are now nesting on sites. Obviously, some of the fish kind of rearing habitat, whether it's pike or, you know, shiners, and, you know, getting that kind of restored hydrology, connecting it back to the river, we've seen great results. I think the challenge is kind of bumping that up to what's the effect on a landscape level. And that's kind of beyond the scope of it. But the other thing that often gets overlooked too is these sites get used extensively during spring and fall migration. Spring migration is easy to miss too, because the weather isn't great, but we get, you know, whether it's ringneck ducks using these, greater yellowlegs coming through, you know, shorebirds and waterfowl that are just stopover habitat. It's really important, but you're not going to see them midsummer. And I think, for some of the sites I have, I do record, kind of do annual counts on waterfowl as well. And like Jim said, there are sites that really didn't have any waterfowl habitat previously. So that said, it would have been great to been able to have that pre-work assessment. It's just there wasn't anything to record then. But yeah, like Jim said, these sites are most of the wildlife, whether it's amphibians or birds, they're moving between habitats. So working on this kind of landscape level is one of the benefits, because they're going to be moving to state land and other private land, and so we're constantly thinking how we can create that wetland complex.
We have a question from Rick Hopkins. For wetland sites restored and protected under easement, how is the question of public access handled?
Yeah, so I'll field that. So the easement itself with the federal government does not have any requirements for allowing public access. So somebody could keep their land, you know, as private land that does not allow public access. They can post it and not allow anybody else out there at their discretion. There's no conflict with that in the program. There are elements of some separate USDA programs that would further incentivize somebody to allow that wetland easement to become available for public access. And so there are nationwide some wetland landowners that have done that. In Vermont, the main way that these sites are available to the public is either the landowner chooses not to post them, which is fairly frequent for most of our wetland easements. Although, as we've seen some of these sites change hands, we've seen new landowners want to post their easements or portions of the easement. The most common way is through the acquisition of the easement itself, which has to be done with a private landowner for the USDA program eligibility reasons. But then once that easement is closed, that landowner is free to sell that easement if they so choose. And we've had many easements that have been sold and acquired by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, oftentimes with their duck stamp funding. And then those areas become wildlife management areas. They are first subject to the easement and the management plan that is set forth through the NRCS easement. But we work, heavily in partnership with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and especially the staff on the ground who manage those refuges, and work with them to make sure that we're all on the same page with the goals of the easement and any special management sites that we want to think about. So that's the main way that I think people would access the land, either acquired by Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department or somebody chooses not to post it.
Any other questions for Jim and Ryan? Feel free to ask it yourself if you're called to do so. Well, I have a question. What would you say is some very simple messaging that staff within the partnership can use about these programs, this opportunity? And the second part of that is if they use that messaging and a landowner is interested, who do they contact? Do they go right to you too?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Ellie. Well, what I would say from a simple messaging standpoint, if somebody is working with somebody and they have already noted, looking at the GIS analysis that's available on the ANR Natural Resources Atlas, that there's potential wetland restoration sites out there. And in their conversation with that farmer or private landowner, they're hearing from them that they're really struggling to make these wetter areas work, that they flood all the time, that it's marginal farmland, and that it's a challenge. That you can make them aware of, there are other opportunities out there for you than to just keep farming this really marginal land and to have to deal with, economic, challenges on this land. And that if they're interested, you could connect them with Ryan and with myself. And, we, like Ryan said, we get those referrals all the time, and we're happy to receive them. We typically do a GIS review at first just to see if it's a site that maybe isn't a good fit, or there's somebody else that it could be a good fit for. But if it looks like a good fit for us, then we will work with a landowner to set up a joint site visit between NRCS and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and whomever that local contact is, and we'll go out there and begin a conversation with a landowner and look at the land and talk about what's possible. And these easement projects can take years to develop, and so we like to always have one sort of in the hopper and working their way through the project process. And so we're happy to go out and to assess these sites, and definitely welcome referrals, because as Ryan said, our best projects really come from people on the ground who have that relationship and then can send something our way.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jim and Ryan? Okay, well, thank you both so much for that informative and engaging presentation and discussion. And thank you all for tuning in and your engagement. I wanted to give a friendly reminder about the next webinar coming up, which will be Wednesday, November 18th from 12 to 1. We will welcome Caitlin Hayes from the Agency of Ag. She's going to join us to talk about the Vermont Phosphorus Innovation Challenge. So we hope to see you then. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.